Hey everybody, Steve Olson here with the Peak Group. I'm glad to talk to you today. We just got our new studio set up so that we can roll some great information out about what we're working on over here. And I think as we do that, one of the best ways to start is to talk about the different ways that you can invest in real estate through the Peak Group. And I'm going to do another episode about how you invest in real estate at large, not just with us, because I think it's important to understand those pros and cons. Because I heard an economist say once, there are no right answers, there are only trade-offs, and real estate is no exceptions. You just have to look at what combination of trade-offs is best for you, and that's what this discussion is all about. So let's talk a little bit about the 3 ways to invest in real estate through the Peak Group. Number 1 is what you're probably most used to. I think investors acquiring properties directly, sometimes we would call that fee simple ownership of real estate, is what we call the certificate of occupancy or CO model. Because here we deal almost exclusively in new construction. I say exclusively, you'll find out why in just a second. In new construction, right, a developer has to go buy land, entitle it, develop it, build the properties, whether they be homes or fourplexes or industrial or hotels or whatever, right? So they have to buy that, and you, the investor, come in and you close when the property is done. There's always a walkthrough and an inspection with the city officials, and they give what's called a certificate of occupancy and say this can be inhabited by human beings. And then your property manager, us, can come in and do their final inspection, because a CO inspection isn't necessarily a rent-ready inspection. I would like to distinguish between the two, right? The inspector come, and I've seen them give certificates of occupancy on properties that nobody's going to want to live in. Obviously, they're just looking at it from a construction and a safety perspective, but a property manager wants to make sure it's clean, the hot water gets hot, the cold water gets cold, the doors all open and close, and everything works so that they don't get a flurry of calls from the tenant when the tenant moves in there. And so as an investor, and this is just a quick highlight on pros and cons because I'm going to go deeper on this in another episode. You're going to buy this thing complete. A lot of times you're going to buy it with a tenant in place or a lease signed where the tenant is moving in the future. So a great pro to this is it's a pretty quantifiable thing. It's a known quantity because you know how much you paid for it, you know what your closing costs were, you know what it's rented for, you know what your expenses are. Although one thing that can wiggle on this are the taxes. When we calculate property taxes, we're going to find the levy rate with the county. The levy rate is the percentage of the property's assessed value that is used to derive the property taxes that are due. And so the levy rate is easy, but it's kind of a wild card as to where the county assessor is going to assess the property's value. So that's the one that moves around a little bit. A lot of times on our pro formas and our projections, we're going to assume that the county is going to use the purchase price as the levy rate. That's a pretty safe way to do it. A lot of times they do come in under, and many times on new construction that first year, you kind of get away with a little bit because the last assessment was maybe just on the land or maybe on a partially complete building. So don't assume it's just going to be that way forever. So the taxes are a little bit of a wild card. The con to investing in the CO model, the certificate of occupancy model, is you're going to be paying at or close to market value because for a developer or builder like us to get the property all the way to that point, it costs time. It costs money. We're going to want to extract the maximum value that we can out of that, but obviously still deliver you a property that's going to bring some cash flow and be a good investment. So that's a little summary of the CO model. The second model that we use is called the investor build model. I have a lot of experience with this. It is like a very sharp double-edged sword. When it works against you, oh boy, it works against you. When it works for you, oh boy, it really works for you. I've seen it go both ways, and there are ways in a future episode that we'll get into that you can kind of mitigate that risk. But it essentially is this. You go and you buy land and you hire a builder and you get either a credit line with a bank or you put up cash and the builder draws from that credit line or cash to build you a property. We have a streamlined way of doing that, so it's not nearly as complicated as it sounds. I jokingly call it sometimes the armchair value add. If you can sign DocuSign requests to release draws to the builder, then this all essentially gets done for you. You just qualify for a loan, put in your down payment, and the property gets built. So you're going to have interest expense along the way. That's called an interest reserve if you get a loan, that the bank collects and they draw on that as the construction progresses. So the pros to this are you can oftentimes, if you've got a little bit of tailwind, gain a tremendous amount of equity and value and cash flow because you got into that property for a good chunk less than it would have cost if it went for a CO model, if that makes sense. So that's a really good pro, is that increased equity and cash flow. The con is things can and do change during construction. So your numbers that you ran at the beginning, will that rent actually be what happens? Will there be other problems? A lot of times construction loans associated with this are tied to the prime rate. So what if that goes up a lot, right? So you could have more interest expenses than you thought. So you have to be very comfortable with your builder, with the area and the market to want to take on that little bit of extra risk for that extra return. In some ways, these two models I've talked about so far, we started at the lowest risk, lowest reward. We went up a notch on investor build. Now we're going all the way to the top where you're taking on maximum risk and maximum reward. I told you earlier that most of the properties that we do are new construction, except for this one, the third one. We call this our concierge BRRRR model. That BRRRR standing for buy, renovate, rent, refinance, and repeat. This is a way to get the most out of your equity or your cash that you're putting into these deals. People do it in their own markets all the time, but many investors that we work with are in expensive markets on the West Coast or overseas or maybe on the East Coast. And it's just not going to happen, at least in any kind of noticeable quantity in their markets. And so they're looking into the inner US, like the Midwest or the South, where this is a little more effective. And the idea is you've got to go buy a property at a discount. That's step one. That's hard to do, right? Many years ago, I date myself, but this was a lot easier to do. But there are more investors in the field now that you have to compete with. So if you're going to buy a property at a discount, guess what? It's not the best imagery, but it's going to have a lot of hair on it. Okay. That could be legal, title, renovation. I've done some of those deals where I had to go get closing docs signed at the prison. That gives you a little idea for what we're dealing with here. But the property sells at a deep discount because it has problems. So then you have to have the legal and or construction resources to fix those problems. And because you had that equity, when that renovation or that title work is complete, you can refinance and you might be able to get all, or in most cases, a good chunk of your original equity back. Quick numbers, let's say you buy it for $100,000. We do this in the Birmingham, Alabama market, by the way. It's a primo market for this. You put in $100,000, but when all the renovations are done, is it worth $175,000? So you can refinance, and I'm just using loose numbers. I didn't spreadsheet this. Give me a little latitude if you would. But maybe if you bought a totally renovated CO'd property for $175,000, it would take 50 or 60,000 of your cash. If you do it this way, it takes 30 or 40 or maybe even less. So you stretch that equity out more. And we have a cool program where an investor, if you bring in $250,000, our goal, and we've modeled it out to where that can get you into 10 rental properties, newly rented and newly refurbished in the Birmingham, Alabama metro. Like I said, construction and timing and higher risk, but higher reward. Like I said to start the video, it's all about trade-offs, and you have to analyze that and pick the best one for you.